rise. Superior Court of the State of Washington County is now in session. The office of presiding.
And good morning, folks. Please be seated.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning, Mr. O'Toole. If you wouldn't mind putting the caption on the record, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. This is the matter of the State of Washington versus Michele Anderson. Case number is 07-1-08717-2. Ms. Anderson is present this morning in court with her counsel. My name is Scott O'Toole, and along with Michelle Morales, we appear on behalf of the state. Thank you.
All right. Good morning again, folks. We're about to have opening statement in this case, and counsel, I believe you guys had a motion that you wanted to present or preserve, Mr. Sorensen?
Your Honor, out of an abundance of caution, just to make the record clear, the state has apprised us that it intends to utilize a number of photographs in their opening statement. We've already litigated the issue of the use of in-life photographs, but since they're being used in this posture before they're admitted, we wanted to reiterate our objection to their use, and I think the court has already ruled on that, but we just want to preserve our objection to the record.
All right. And Mr. O'Toole, any response whatsoever?
My only response is, I believe that Mr. Sorensen said the state has apprised us, not surprised us. Just want to make sure that was clear in the record.
Okay, I think it was apprised.
It was apprised.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, the issue has already been ruled on, but consider it preserved for the record. And also, it's my understanding that at least at this point in time, the defense is anticipating reserving opening statement to the conclusion of the state's presentation of its case in chief. Is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
Okay, if that should change, let me know, but I just wanted to make sure that that was the current game plan. Is there anything else that we need to address before the jury comes out for opening statement, counsel?
Not from the state, thank you.
No, Your Honor.
Okay, there's one thing I would like to clarify for the record, and for the folks that are in the audience who have been following this case and the media coverage. Yesterday there was an article in the Seattle Times that quoted me a little bit out of context, and I think it requires some clarification. The quote was to the effect that this case is a disaster, and I want to make it very, very clear for the benefit of the folks in attendance and the record itself that this case I was referring to was the case of State versus Townsend, which is the Supreme Court case that precludes the trial judge from informing the jury that the death penalty is not at issue. We've been trying to comply with that case law while at the same time trying to avoid turning the jury selection process into an unnecessary and cumbersome death penalty qualification process. It has been, as I said, a very imprecise dance with many potential pitfalls. I should also clarify that the Townsend case does not hold that we cannot tell the jury whether or not the death penalty is a potential punishment. In fact, if the death penalty is a potential punishment, then we are required to tell the jury and engage in a lengthy voir dire process to determine whether the prospective jurors are qualified to sit on the jury when that punishment is potentially available. The only time we are precluded from informing the jury of the potential punishment is when the death penalty is not at issue. I think that brief synopsis may help you understand the awkwardness of the situation and the reason for my remark. Again, this case, meaning the one presently being tried before me, was not the case I was referring to in my comment, and I hope that clarifies things a little bit. And I don't know if any of the attorneys have anything to say about that, but I just wanted to make sure that the statement was put back into the appropriate context. So with that, are we ready for the jury, folks?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, then Kenya, if you'd be so kind as to bring them out.
Please rise for the jury. Front row there, all the way up one step and all the way up through this chair. Six. And back row, we're going to go those 2 steps all the way through this chair.
All right, welcome back, folks, and please be seated. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You're about to hear opening statement of counsel with regard to this case, and you'll remember back a week ago I told you that you'd be allowed to take notes if you wish and so forth and so on. You'll note that I haven't provided you the notebooks or any pens and pencils at this point in time, and the reason for that is something I want to reinforce right now. Opening statement is the opportunity for counsel to tell you what they believe the evidence will be at trial. Counsel's statement, however, is not evidence itself. So I'm going to withhold handing out the notebooks until we actually begin that process of presenting evidence before you after opening statement. And the reason I don't give you the notebooks right now is to reinforce that notion that the statements of counsel are not evidence themselves. And with that, Mr. O'Toole, are you ready to present opening statement on behalf of the state?
I am, Your Honor.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you please give your attention to Mr. O'Toole. Mr. O'Toole.
May it please the court. Counsel, Ms. Anderson. Members of the jury, good morning. Members of the jury, those of us who live in King County know that as big as Seattle is, as much development as there's been in Seattle on the east side, down south in the valley, along the I-5 corridor, over in Interstate 405, along the I-90 corridor and 520. As big as this portion of the county is, if you go just a few miles east of this building, it's a very, very different place. A very different King County. It's rural, the terrain tends to be hilly, almost mountainous, and it's heavily forested. Many of the roads in those rural parts of King County are not really roads at all. Some of them, although they're denominated roads, sometimes become sort of gravel driveways. The houses are far apart. Sometimes the neighbors go days or weeks without even seeing each other, and there's nothing amiss or anything unusual about that. 346th Avenue Northeast, just outside Carnation, is one of those roads I just talked about. The main road that leads to it is Northeast 16th Street. And Northeast 346th tees onto Northeast 16th, and it goes sort of south to north, but very, very quickly turns into a gravel driveway. As you travel along 346, along that gravel driveway, you pass residences. Immediately on the left, as you go past the mailboxes, there's a small, modest house with a number of outbuildings. A little farther up along the road on the right is the Wilsons' home, a little bit newer construction. The Wilsons have been there for many, many years. And as you pass the Wilsons' home, a little bit farther up that driveway, as it begins to climb a little bit in elevation, you come to a gate. That gate is locked and secure. There's a big, heavy chain that keeps it tethered to the post. And on both posts on either side of that gate, there are signs that say, "Keep out" and "No trespassing." When that gate swings open, the driveway, the road, continues up. It curves up and to the right, and about halfway up on that road, just as it turns to the right, as the elevation increases, there is another residence on your left. It's a single-wide trailer or mobile home. There's a truck parked outside of it. And its address is 1910 346th Avenue Northeast, Carnation. As you walk up that driveway, past that residence on your left, and you continue up to the end of the driveway, you get to the main residence, the home of Wayne and Judy Anderson. It's a single-story home, blue in color. It rests on about 5.5 acres. It's very, very rural and very, very secluded. It's about a quarter mile up from that main street, Northeast 16th. There's a number of outbuildings surrounding that home. There's a big garage, shop, where Wayne Anderson used to do his hobbies. There's cars parked here and there around the property. And on the back side of that home, there is a storage shed. Members of the jury, on December 24th, 2007, Christmas Eve, more than 8 years ago, two people, this woman, Michele Anderson, and her boyfriend, a person by the name of Joe McEnroe, walked out of that mobile home that's about halfway up that driveway on the left. They got into their truck and they drove up to the main house. They parked that truck, they walked up onto the porch, and they went through the front door. Members of the jury, nobody lives in that home anymore. Michele Anderson and her boyfriend stayed but a few hours, a very short time indeed. But when they were done, a family that had lived in that home for 30 years lay dead. 6 people. 2 grandparents, their son and daughter-in-law, and their 2 grandchildren. When that woman, Michele Anderson, and her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe, walked up to the front door of that house, they were well prepared and well armed. She carried, hidden in a sweatshirt, a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. He carried a .357 caliber revolver. But they also were armed with something else. The trust of the people inside that home and hatred for the people inside that home. When that woman, Michele Anderson, and her boyfriend left, when they were done inside that home at the top of the driveway, they walked out, got into their truck, and drove back down to their mobile home. And they began to destroy evidence. And they also began to plan their next move, which was to flee. Members of the jury, I'm going to take you back in time more than 8 years to Christmas Eve, 2007. December 24th, because when that Christmas Eve began, Wayne Anderson and Judy Anderson and Scott Anderson and Erica Anderson and Olivia Anderson and Nathan Anderson were 6 alive human beings. Their only mistake was to be related to this woman, Michele Anderson. Their only mistake was to have befriended her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe. This trial is about those 6 human beings and what this woman and her boyfriend did to them. As you know from our jury selection and from what Judge Ramsell has instructed you, my name is Scott O'Toole. I'm a deputy prosecuting attorney for King County, and along with Ms. Morales, we represent the state of Washington in this case. As Judge Ramsell just mentioned, this part of the case is called the opening statement. And the opening statement is an opportunity for the lawyers to present to you an overview of what they believe the evidence will be. Oftentimes, evidence comes in bits and pieces. Witnesses testify maybe not quite in the chronological order that the events themselves occurred. So the opening statement is that bit of a preview or an outline of the evidence, so hopefully it'll make more sense to you as you receive it. In this case, as in every case, there are primarily 2 types of evidence. Number 1, there will be the oral testimony of witnesses under oath who will take that witness stand, take an oath, and tell you what they know. In addition, there's something called tangible evidence that you'll receive. And tangible evidence tends to be such things as charts and maps and photographs, documents, and items of personal property. As you know from the charge that Judge Ramsell has given you, the defendant is accused of 6 crimes. 6 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree. That crime, that allegation, is contained in a legal document called the information. And the information in this case states that on December 24th, 2007, the defendant assaulted Wayne Anderson in count 1, Judy Anderson, count 2, Scott Anderson, count 3, Erica Anderson, count 4, Olivia Anderson, count 5, and Nathan Anderson, count 6. It alleges that the defendant acted with intent to cause the death of each of her 6 victims, that intent was premeditated, and that each victim died as a result of the defendant's acts and Joseph McEnroe's acts, and that all of that occurred in King County. You also know from jury selection that there are two aggravating factors in this case. The first one is that there are multiple victims: Wayne and Judy, Scott and Erica, Olivia and Nathan. And counts 4, 5, and 6 allege an additional aggravating factor: that the victims in those three counts, Erica and her children, Olivia and Nathan, were murdered to conceal the commission of a crime, the other murders that they witnessed, or to protect the identity of those who committed the crime, Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe. Now, in order for you to convict the defendant of the crimes with which she's charged, the state must prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt each of the elements of those crimes. It is a burden that Ms. Morales and I embrace, and what exactly those elements are will be instructed to you by the court upon the conclusion of the case. I mentioned you're going to hear the testimony of a number of witnesses under oath from this witness stand. You'll hear from civilian witnesses, from law enforcement witnesses, and from expert witnesses. The law enforcement witnesses will be primarily those who investigated the case. You've met Detective Scott Tompkins. He was the lead detective on the case. Those who investigated, forensic scientists from the State Patrol Crime Lab who helped research and investigate the case, as well as testimony from the King County Medical Examiner. But not all of the witnesses in this case will be law enforcement witnesses. There'll be a lot of civilian witnesses as well. I think you'll find that some of them are somewhat anxious about testifying, traumatized by what they may have seen, what they may have experienced, difficult to remember things 8 years later, worried whether or not they'll remember things accurately or fairly or comprehensively. But as we discussed in jury selection, at the conclusion of this case, when you assess their testimony, keep in mind that you, jurors, not the lawyers, not the judge, you are the sole judges of the credibility of every witness called in this case, no matter called by whom. Let me tell you a little bit about Wayne and Judy, Scott and Erica, Nathan and Olivia. Wayne Anderson in December of 2007 was 60 years old. He'd worked for Boeing for many years. He was a husband. He'd been married to Judy for 31 years. This is a picture, a photograph, of Wayne Anderson and Judy at a Boeing function a couple of years before their death. Wayne was also a father. He adopted a child, Mary Victoria Anderson, Judy's daughter. He also had a son named Scott, who was born in 1975, and a daughter, Michele, who was born in 1978. It is Michele Anderson who sits in court with us today. He was also a grandfather of Mary Victoria's children and a grandfather of Scott and Erica's children, Olivia and Nathan. Wayne and Judy had bought the property, the Carnation property, in the late 70s, and that property included the home at the end of the driveway and that mobile home about halfway down. Now, Judy Anderson in December of 2007 was 61 years old, married to Wayne. She worked in the post office and had worked there for many, many, many years in Carnation. Everybody apparently knows everybody in Carnation. Well, Judy knew everybody and everybody knew Judy. But she was also a mother to Mary Victoria and to Scott and to Michele, and of course a grandmother again to Mary Victoria's children and to Scott and Erica's two children, Olivia and Nathan. Scott Anderson was Wayne and Judy's son. This is a picture, a photograph of Scott Anderson. In December 2007, Scott Anderson was 32 years old, the middle child between two sisters. He grew up in Carnation, graduated from Cedar Crest High School, played football, was a very, very good student, went to the University of Washington and graduated from there. He worked construction and carpentry, and he married his high school sweetheart, Erica. Erica Anderson, Scott's wife, also was 32 years old in December of 2007. This is a photograph of Erica. She also grew up in Carnation. She graduated from Tolt High School a year before Scott. She met Scott, and of course she was the young mother of Nathan and Olivia. Olivia was born in April of 2002. On December 24th, 2007, Olivia was 5 years old. This is a photograph of Olivia Anderson. Nathan Anderson was born on December 10th, 2004. On Christmas Eve, 2007, he had just turned 3 years old. The defendant, Michele Anderson, grew up in that home at the end of the driveway at the top of the hill. In December of 2007, she was 29 years old. She also attended Cedar Crest High School. She'd worked at a number of different jobs as a security guard, painting children's faces at festivals and things like that. But in December of 2007, she'd quit her job and hadn't worked in a year. Joseph McEnroe, her boyfriend, grew up in various locations around the country. He lived in California, he lived in North Carolina. In the early 2000s, he contacted Michele Anderson, or she contacted him. They had an online relationship. They met online. She invited him to come out to Washington State. He did come out to Washington State in the early 2000s. The day that he moved out, he moved in with Michele Anderson, and they were a couple from that point on. They lived in a number of different locations once he arrived in the area. They lived down in Kent. They lived in a mobile home in Falls City. But eventually, in early 2000, less than a year before the murders, in early 2000, they were invited by Michelle's parents, Wayne and Judy, to move into that mobile home on their property. They could move in there rent-free, no expenses. They didn't have to pay their utilities. They didn't have to pay insurance or anything. In order to help out Michele and her boyfriend, Wayne and Judy made that offer to them, which they accepted in the spring of 2007. And in fact, Wayne and Judy even helped them move in. Members of the jury, Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2007, was like Christmas Eve in many, many homes all across America. That afternoon, there was a roast in the oven. A Christmas tree was up and decorated. Judy was wrapping presents back in the craft room. Wayne was watching television. Wayne was in the family room, relaxing, because for Wayne, Christmas Eve was his holiday. That's when he liked having his children and his grandchildren over. And in fact, a big family get-together was planned for that afternoon, Christmas Eve. Children would be there. His grandchildren would be there. They would have presents, and they would celebrate the holiday. Michele and her boyfriend Joe were coming. Scott and Erica and their 2 small children were coming. And they do sometime in the middle to late afternoon. And perhaps even the oldest daughter, Mary Victoria, would be there as well. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon of December 24th, 2007, the defendant Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe got into that truck, drove up the driveway to the main residence, walked onto the porch, walked through the front door, and everything changed. 2 days later, the day after Christmas, December 26th, 2007, just before 8 o'clock in the morning, 911 operators received a frantic telephone call from a woman named Linda Teely. And Linda Teely was calling to report that she had found multiple dead bodies. Linda was calling from the home of her very, very close friend, Judy Anderson. That home was at 1806 346th Avenue Northeast in Carnation, that home at the top of that driveway. Linda and Judy had worked together at the post office for years. Both were in their early 60s. They were co-workers and very, very close friends. Linda told the 911 operator that she was working the day after Christmas and that Judy didn't show up for work at her appointed time. And that was very unusual for Judy because she was very punctual, very committed, very, very reliable when it came to work. She would simply not just show up. Linda became concerned, so she tried to call Judy a number of times and received no answer. And after calling the last time at about 7:30 in the morning, she made a decision, I've got to go find out what's wrong. So Linda Teely left her job at the post office. She drove the 10 minutes or so to the Anderson residence. She drove on Northeast 16th to 346, where that sort of driveway road begins. She took a left and started driving up that gravel driveway. She knew the way. She'd been there many times before. Linda Teely, of course, was a mail carrier. Linda drove up the driveway, but not quite halfway. She drove past the mailboxes, past the residence on the left, past the Wilsons on the right, and she got up to that gate, and she found that it was locked and secured. At the gate, since she couldn't get past in her car, she got out, and she walked around. She walked around the gate, walked up the driveway as it began its climb, curved to the right, and all the way up to the main house. And she'll tell you it's a long walk. It's about a quarter mile, and that she was feeling it in her knees the entire way. Linda arrived at the top of the driveway, Judy's house. She walked up onto the front porch. She rang the doorbell, and there was no answer. And then Linda did something that maybe you only do in rural King County. She tried the front door. She turned the doorknob, and it was unlocked. When she discovered it was unlocked, Linda slowly pushed that front door open. And it was very, very dark inside. It's just before 8 o'clock in the morning, the day after Christmas. There's very little light out. It's overcast. The curtains are drawn. The only ambient lighting that's there is that which is coming from the outside. And it was very dark indeed. But Linda could see right in front of her the body of a man lying on his back in the middle of the room. And her first reaction was carbon monoxide poisoning, because it didn't seem like a whole lot of other things were disturbed inside the room. She took another step in, and she saw another body, the body of a young woman. And another step, and she saw a third body, the body of a young boy lying next to that young woman. She looked down at the scene, more closely at the man, and she saw that he had been shot in the face. The woman was slumped onto the floor, leaning up against a love seat, resting against her back against that, and she too had been shot. The little boy was lying on his side next to her. He too had been shot. Well, as you can imagine, Linda Teely began to panic. She's in this darkened house. There are 3 dead bodies. It's the day after Christmas, and nobody is home. Linda Teely panicked. She started looking all over for a cell phone, because Linda Teely does not own, for a landline. She doesn't own a cell phone. She started looking all over the house for a phone, and she walked down the long hallway to the back of the house, to one of the bedrooms, and she found a landline. She called 911 from that landline. But she was scared, and she'll tell you, she kind of wedged herself in that back bedroom, which was dark, between the wall and the bed as she was on the phone whispering to 911. Because she was on a landline, she couldn't leave and still stay in contact with 911. She called 911, reported that there were 3 people dead inside the home of her best friend, Judy Anderson. 911 contacted the King County Sheriff's Office, and deputies responded coming from North Bend. But meanwhile, Linda Teely was still inside that home, on the phone, talking to the 911 operator and trying to hide. Because, you see, there were 3 dead bodies in that home, and she didn't know if the person who had done that was still on the property or still in the home. She was scared to death. You will hear that 911 call in the course of this trial. As I mentioned, King County Sheriff's Office deputies were called. They responded to the scene in response to Linda Teely's 911 call. They arrived. They drove up 346th Avenue Northeast. They got to the gate. They saw Linda Teely's car parked there, and 4 deputies got out of their car and walked around the gate, up the road towards the main house. All of them had weapons drawn. One of them was armed with a semi-automatic assault rifle. They passed that single wide home on their left as they went up. They continued up the hill, and they'll tell you it was eerily quiet the day after Christmas, just after 8 o'clock in the morning, and they could hear nothing. As they approached the main house at the top, the deputies took cover behind some of the cars that were there. They called into the 911 operator and asked her to ask Linda Teely to come outside. And she did. She came outside. She reported to them what she had seen inside, the 3 dead bodies. And she was in shock. 3 of the deputies went inside the home. One of them stayed with Linda Teely outside. 3 went inside the home and saw the same 3 bodies, the man, the woman, and the little boy, there in the family room. Both adults were dead, and the little boy was dead. They then, with weapons drawn, searched the house, looking for more victims, and also looking for the person who had done this. They walked all the way to that back bedroom where Linda Teely had made her 911 call, and they started walking back out towards the main area, towards the living room and the family room. And as they walked back out, they were in a slightly different perspective than when they walked in through the front door. They looked at the scene, and they saw there was another body, the body of a little girl, lying face down, wedged between the sofa and the coffee table, next to her mother, underneath her mother's right arm. And that little girl had a bullet hole in the back of her head. The adults in that room were eventually identified. The man, Scott Anderson. The woman who had collapsed next to the couch, his wife, Erica Anderson. Wayne and Judy's son and daughter-in-law. The little boy lying next to Erica, with a bullet hole in his left temple, was 3-year-old Nathan Anderson. The little girl tucked underneath her mother's arm, wedged between that sofa and that coffee table, was 5-year-old Olivia Anderson. And as they watched this scene, one of the deputies noticed what he thought was a blood trail leading from that scene in the family room through the kitchen, possibly towards the back door. And outside that back door, there was a deck. Well, the deputies decided at that point, they still got to clear this area. They don't know if there are other victims. They don't know if the person who did this or persons who did this were on the property. So with weapons still drawn, they retreated out the front door, and they walked over to the big barn or the shed I mentioned to you where Wayne did his crafts. They cleared that. There was nobody there. And then they started in a clockwise direction around the house, and they got to the backyard. When they're in the backyard, they saw a storage shed, that one I mentioned to you that's in the backyard, of some distance from the house. And from a distance, they could see in front of that storage shed something lying there, some type of a mound or something there. And they walked up, and what they found was a piece of carpeting, just lying there on top of something bulky underneath. When they lifted the carpeting, they found the body of Wayne Anderson. Wayne Anderson was clad only in a t-shirt with his pants pulled down around his ankles, and he too had been shot in the head. And those deputies immediately reported to dispatch there were now 5 victims. Well, Wayne was lying immediately in front of that shed, and the door to that shed was closed, and there was a latch on it. One of the deputies unhinged that latch and opened the door and looked inside. And inside that shed was the body of Judy Anderson. She too had been shot in the head. And the deputies reported to 911 6 victims. The fire department was called, and sometime later, a little while later, they appeared and they confirmed that all 6 victims on the Anderson property were dead. Well, one of the things that Linda Thiele had mentioned in her 911 call was that Wayne and Judy had a daughter named Michele, and that daughter lived on property. Detectives confirmed that, in fact, there was that lower residence, that single wide trailer halfway down the driveway, and that Michele Anderson lived there with her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe. That the address was 1910 346th Avenue Northeast. They went down to that property about 9:45 in the morning, 10 o'clock. They went to that property, to Michele Anderson and Joe McEnroe's trailer, to see if there were any more victims inside. They knocked on the front door and they heard nothing. They forced entry. They knocked their way through the front door. There was nobody inside. No victims, no one at all. And they noticed how filthy and how dirty it was inside, and how cold. Well, the investigation then began immediately. Once they had checked out Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe's residence, the detectives began doing what detectives do in murder investigations, investigating the crime. The detectives began collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, anybody who might have information about the Andersons. Who would do this? Who would hold that much ill will towards this family to do this? Locating and identifying neighbors, taking photographs, things like that. And one of the first things they did is they set up a perimeter down where 346th tees on the main street, Northeast 16. They set up that perimeter to keep out the curious and to secure the crime scene. Because word got out pretty quickly. That's a quiet, rural area in King County. And word got out that there was something going on at the Andersons. And by 11 o'clock in the morning, there was a huge police presence there. Pretty unusual for that area of the county. There was yellow tape strewn all about across the roads and stopping people from driving up the driveway. There were dozens of police vehicles. There was a mobile command center, helicopters, scores of uniformed officers all around there. And there was a very large press contingent with their own trucks and vans and helicopters. At about 11 o'clock that same morning, December 26, 2007, 2 people arrived at that perimeter. at the foot of the driveway, 346th Avenue Northeast, right near the mailboxes. They were driving a black pickup truck. It was being driven by this woman, Michele Anderson. They said that they lived on the Anderson property, and Ms. Anderson, Michele Anderson, was requesting permission to return to her home, the 1910 residence, halfway up. The two were identified as Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe. Michele Anderson was the 29-year-old daughter of Wayne and Judy. Joseph McEnroe, also 29, was her boyfriend. When the defendant and Joe McEnroe arrived at that location, they were contacted by a sheriff's deputy who was trying to maintain order, trying to keep people out who shouldn't be there. And they were told that there was a police investigation in progress, although it was quite obvious from the number of officers and cars and helicopters and all the things that were going on. There was a huge police investigation in progress. And Michele Anderson's first question to that officer, to that deputy, was, "Is it at the Wilson's house?" That house that's just right off the street as you walk up that driveway. Joe McEnroe told that deputy that he and Michele had been on their way to Las Vegas to get married. They'd had a flat tire and decided to return home. But both of them agreed to walk up that driveway and to talk to officers and to detectives. Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe walked up that driveway freely. They were not in custody. They were not handcuffed, nor were they searched. There was no reason to. As they walked, neither Michele Anderson nor Joseph McEnroe asked what was going on. Neither of them asked why they were not being allowed to return to their home, and neither of them inquired in any way whether Michele Anderson's family was safe. Well, as you can imagine, the detectives, Detective Tompkins in particular, as the lead detective, were quite interested in talking to Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe. Detective Tompkins' purpose in doing so was twofold. Number one, he was looking for background information. He wanted to talk to her about her family. He knew that there were 6 dead bodies upstairs in that main residence at the end of the driveway. Who could do this? And equally important, whoever did this was still on the loose. So any information he could get about the family, who would hold ill will for them, who would want this to happen, he wanted to interview Michele and Joe as quickly as possible. The second reason he needed to sit down with Michele Anderson is what is called a death notification. It happens in almost all homicide investigations. Often it is left to the police, to officers and detectives, to contact next of kin and to tell them there's been a tragedy in their lives. In this case, there were 6 members of the Anderson family who were dead. Michele Anderson's parents, her brother, her sister-in-law, her niece, and her nephew. And someone had to tell her. So Detective Tompkins asked her if she would come with him and sit in the front seat of his car, and she did willingly. She got on the passenger side, he got on the driver's side, and he decided he would talk about the background questions first. His concern was, as he looked, and I'll tell you, he looked at her eyes to see if there's any sign that she'd been crying, if there's any sign that she was aware of what had happened, and there was nothing. So she got into the front passenger seat, he got into the driver's seat, and they began to talk. And one of the reasons why he decided to ask her background questions first, rather than the death notification, was he was concerned if he gave her the death notification, she would understandably become so distraught he wouldn't be able to get more information from her, and he needed that desperately. Because as I say, there were 6 dead bodies, and whoever did that was still on the loose. Because Joseph McEnroe was not a family member, he was separated from Michele Anderson. He was assigned to Detective Jake Pavlovich, who interviewed him at the same time that Detective Tompkins interviewed Michele Anderson. They got into, as I mentioned, Detective Tompkins' car. She was in the front seat. And as Detective Tompkins situated himself in the driver's seat, Michele Anderson asked this question, looking at all of what was going on around her. Did someone steal my IROC? Now, for those of you who are not car buffs, which would include me, an IROC is a Chevy Camaro. And she had a broken-down Chevy Camaro IROC sitting on her property. Did somebody steal my IROC? Detective Tompkins' initial conversation with Michele Anderson began just after 11 o'clock that morning of December 26th, and that initial portion of the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. He confirmed her address, the 1910 residence on 346th Avenue Northeast, confirmed that she lived there with Joseph McEnroe. She told him that her mother and father, Wayne and Judy, lived up the main residence at the end of the driveway, that she had a sister named Mary Victoria Anderson who lived in North Bend. She also mentioned she had a brother named Scott, that Scott was married to Erica, and that they had 2 children. Olivia, she wasn't sure of the age, 5 or 6, and Nathan, who was 3. And during that initial portion of the conversation, not recorded because Detective Tompkins thought he would be giving a death notification, and you don't record death notifications given to next of kin. During that initial portion of the conversation, Michele Anderson never asked what the police cars were doing there. She never asked why the media was there. And she never asked if her family was safe. She told Detective Tompkins that she had last seen her parents on the morning of Christmas Eve, the morning of December 24th, 2007. That she and Joe McEnroe had gone up to her parents' home and told them the exciting news that they were going to Las Vegas to get married. She said that her parents were thrilled that she and Joe McEnroe were going to get married. And she told Detective Tompkins that they left the property, they left her parents' residence between 4 and 5 o'clock on the afternoon of December 24th, 2007. Well, Detective Tompkins was already aware from earlier work he had done that morning that there had been a 911 call from that property, from Wayne and Judy's home, just after 5 o'clock on December 24th, 2007. And he noted that the time that Michele Anderson said that she left that property was almost the exact same time that the 911 call had come in. Since it looked like Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe hadn't actually gone to Las Vegas, Detective Tompkins asked where they'd been, what they'd been doing. And she said they'd been out driving around. She kind of gave some listless, vague answers about getting lost in Monroe and things that had happened to the truck and that the trip just hadn't worked out. And he asked, well, where'd you stay last night? And Michele Anderson said that, well, they sort of took naps in the car. They parked alongside in the truck, and they parked alongside the road and slept when they needed to. And as this conversation continued, Detective Tompkins still continued to be struck by the fact that Michele Anderson was not asking any questions about what was going on around her. Nothing about the surrounding environment at all. So Detective Tompkins stepped outside of his car. He contacted his sergeant, a guy by the name of Mark Toner. And he said to Sergeant Toner, I don't know what's going on, but something's not right here. Tell Jake, Detective Jake Pavlovich, who was with Joseph McEnroe, tell Jake to get a lockdown statement from McEnroe, especially on the timeline of what these guys have been doing. When he did that, when he had that conversation with Detective Toner, he then got back into his own car, and he asked Michele Anderson if he could record their conversation, record their interview, and she agreed. That recorded statement begins at 11:17 a.m. on the morning of December 26, 2007. And the initial portion of it goes for about 45 minutes. In that recorded conversation, in that taped conversation, Michele Anderson talked about her family, how well she and her parents got along, how she and her mother Judy had gone Christmas shopping the day before Christmas Eve, December 23, 2007, and that Judy, in fact, had bought her a Simpsons movie for Christmas. She said that she and her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe, visited her parents on the morning of Christmas Eve, that Judy and Wayne were making a roast and were wrapping presents. She mentioned that they told them of their plans to go to Las Vegas. They were aware that Scott and Erica were coming over with the children later that afternoon. And she said that she told Detective Tompkins that her dad was a Christmas Eve kind of guy. He really mentioned, as I mentioned a few moments ago, he really liked Christmas Eve because that's when he could have his children and his grandchildren over together. And when Detective Tompkins asked Michele Anderson, how was your relationship with your parents? Her response, fine. She said that after they told her parents about the wedding plans, they started driving to Las Vegas. I mentioned that they had the car problems, the truck problems. They turned around and decided to come back. And then Detective Tompkins asked Michele Anderson, do you own any firearms? Michele Anderson said, well, they used to own some firearms, that she only had shot them once, that those firearms were now in storage in a back room in the trailer that they occupied halfway up that driveway. That initial interview, taped interview with Michele Anderson, lasted about 45 minutes, during the course of which Detective Tompkins was joined by another detective named Sue Peters, who sat in the back seat, took some notes, asked some questions. Michele Anderson maintained throughout the course of that 45 minutes that all was fine when she and Joe McEnroe left that property, all was fine when she left her parents, all was fine when they told them they were going to Las Vegas to get married. In fact, she even said that the last thing she saw her mother, Judy, doing was wrapping presents for the kids. And she even mentioned that she saw a toy truck on the floor of the craft room ready to be wrapped for 3-year-old Nathan. She also knew, and she said, she and Joseph McEnroe left before Scott, Erica, and the children arrived. Members of the jury, almost every single statement that Michele Anderson made in that 45-minute segment of the conversation was a lie. At about 11:54 in the morning, as that conversation continued, Detective Tompkins began asking Michele Anderson about the fact that she wasn't responding to what was going on around her. The police vehicles, the media trucks, and the helicopters. And Detective Tompkins asked Michele Anderson, "What do you think all these police cars are here for?" And she responded, "I think the house is on fire." Detective Tompkins asked, "Whose house?" And her response, "Probably my mom and dad's." Detective Peters asked her, "What do you think happened?" 2 times she said, "I don't know. I don't know." And then she said, my dad might have had a heart attack." Detective Tompkins mentioned to her that law enforcement doesn't usually show up in that much force for a reported heart attack. At 11:58 a.m. during that conversation, Detective Tompkins asked the defendant, "Would you ever harm your family?" And she replied, "No." That too was a lie. Detective Peters then asked her in a voice so faint that it almost sounds like a whisper. She said, "I think you might know a little bit more about why we're here. You have to talk to Scott and I about that." And Detective Tompkins at that point says on the tape, "Michele, let me tell you a couple of things we're really good at." But he didn't complete the sentence because Michele Anderson at that point blurted out, "It's my fault." When she was asked what happened, she simply said, "I'm sorry." And over the course of the next couple of hours, the detectives learned not only what happened, but they also learned why it happened. The first thing that Michele Anderson said when she was asked what happened was this, quote, "My brother owes me a lot of money," unquote. "I just wanted back the money he took from me. My parents weren't even, I don't care about it, I love my family so much, and it hurt when he took that money and didn't give it back." And the detectives asked him, "So you guys were discussing the money?" And she answered, "Yes." She talked repeatedly, after she said it was my fault, repeatedly about how much money her brother owed her, how angry she was with her parents because they were going to kick her out. They told her she needed to pay rent for the residence down the hill, and about how angry she was at her parents because they always seemed to side with Scott, that he seemed to be the favored child. But she also talked about the murders themselves. Michele Anderson talked about driving up to her parents' home on Christmas Eve, driving up that driveway, parking that truck outside, and going inside. She talked about how she went inside with the intention to confront her father, Wayne Anderson, and that she got into an argument with her parents. And she said, quote, "I just wanted Scott to give me my money back." Now, Scott's not there yet with Erica. They're not coming for another couple of hours. But she was there to confront her parents and to complain about how much she hated her brother because apparently he owed her some money. They also argued because Wayne and Judy said to her, "You guys need to start paying some rent." And in fact, during the course of the argument, Judy walked off and Michele Anderson became very angry. The defendant said to her father, quote, "I did so much for the family and everybody abused me and attacked me so much. All I want is my money back so I can leave." Now, although they argued that morning, the defendant had planned for much more than an argument. She told the detectives that when she talked to Wayne, she had a secret. She was holding a sweatshirt in her hand, and inside that sweatshirt, wrapped inside that sweatshirt, was a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. She went into the kitchen, she took the gun out of her sweatshirt, she came back, and she shot Wayne. She was asked why, and her answer was, quote, "I just shot him because I was fed up," unquote. Well, where was McEnroe during this time? She told the detectives that she had told Joe McEnroe that she was going to get her dad and then shoot her mom, and that McEnroe was back in the back room with Judy wrapping presents. His role in this was to distract Judy so that she could shoot her father. What's more, Michele Anderson was not the only one with a gun that morning. She had that gun wrapped up in her sweatshirt. But Joseph McEnroe had a gun too, a .357 revolver in a side holster he was wearing concealed underneath his jacket. Michele Anderson fired that first shot at her father and it in all likelihood missed. But her gun jammed, her 9mm jammed. And those of you who know something about semi-automatics, there's a slide on 9mm that goes back and moves forward and puts the next bullet into the chamber. That 9mm that Michele Anderson was carrying jammed, in all likelihood, because it was wrapped inside the sweatshirt and it got caught on the fabric. It jammed, she panicked, and McEnroe rushed into the room. He pulled out his .7 revolver, held it up to Wayne's head, and fired a shot into his brain. Judy, who had been wrapping presents in that back craft room, heard the commotion, and she ran out to the family room, living room area of the home. She saw that Wayne was shot in front of her, and she began to scream. Michele Anderson's 9mm was still jammed, but Joe McEnroe still had his .357 revolver. Judy ran into the kitchen, trying to escape, and she was trapped. She was pinned between a wall of the kitchen and a refrigerator in the corner. She was unable to move or to get away, and she began to cower in the corner. Joseph McEnroe then advanced on her and fired a bullet into her neck, which lodged in her spine, and she collapsed to the floor. He then stepped forward and shot her in the head. Wayne and Judy were now dead, both shot. But what to do now? Well, there was more. There was more to do because, remember, this is Christmas Eve, and Scott and Erica and the children are on their way over. Michele Anderson described for the detectives how she and Joe McEnroe dragged Wayne and Judy's bodies out of the house, trying to hide those bodies in the shed. She said that she dragged Judy's body because she knew Scott and Erica and the children were coming over, and she wanted to be able to confront Scott about the money he owed her. She said that they dumped Judy's body in the shed and closed the door. Wayne was more of a problem. Wayne was a big guy, 6 feet tall, 270 pounds, and they really couldn't carry him very well. So Joe McEnroe and Michele Anderson dragged Wayne Anderson's body through the pantry area, onto the back deck, across the back lawn, and dumped his body in front of that shed. And because they couldn't lift him into the shed, they simply got a piece of carpeting that was there leaning against the shed, and they threw it over his body to conceal it. Why? Well, Michele Anderson told the detectives, quote, "I drug him in the backyard so when Scott came over, I could try to get my money from him and just leave." Then Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe got towels and rugs and attempted to clean up that scene inside the home. There was blood everywhere. They wiped up blood from the kitchen floor. They wiped up blood from the hallway. They wiped up blood that was on the refrigerator. And then they disposed of the towels and the rugs. And they waited. They didn't have to wait long. Earlier that day, Erica Anderson had talked to her mother, Pam Mantle. She told her mom that they were going to the Andersons for Christmas Eve. They planned on leaving at about 4 in the afternoon. She and Scott and the kids lived in Black Diamond, so it would take probably about 45 minutes to an hour to get there, and they would arrive at about 5 o'clock. Well, Scott and Erica and those children did arrive at the Andersons about an hour after Wayne and Judy were shot. They got there. It was dark. It was Christmas Eve. It was very, very quiet. Scott and Erica and the kids went inside Wayne and Judy's home, and they began to relax. Erica took off her shoes. The kids began to play, and Scott sat in his normal seat at the end of the sofa. But at one point, Scott said, "Where's Mom and Dad?" And Michele Anderson answered, "They're in the bathroom." And then she began to argue with her brother about the money that she said he owed him, that she wanted to have repaid, about her car. As she said to the detectives, quote, "I said I want my money back and I want my car back," unquote. And while she's talking to Scott Anderson, he's seated on the couch, she is standing behind a lazy boy chair that was her dad's favorite chair. So she's shielded from Scott Anderson. While she's doing that, she has now hidden inside a sweatshirt the .357 revolver this time. And she's arguing with her brother, and Joseph McEnroe was standing next to her, because as she told the detectives, quote, "I was just to shoot everybody." McEnroe's role, quote, "He was just there in case the gun jammed." She argued with her brother. She pulled out the .357 revolver because the 9mm was still jammed, and Scott became alarmed, as you can imagine. His wife and his children were less than 6 feet away, and his parents were nowhere to be found. And he began to rise off the couch. When he did that, Michele Anderson took out that .357, pointed it at his face, and shot him in the face. The bullet entered just below his mouth and eventually lodged into his lung. He was grievously wounded, but he managed to get off the couch and to try and struggle with Michele Anderson to get that gun away from her. They struggled across the family room, over near the curtains. You'll see the evidence of this in the course of this trial. And all that time, trying to get the gun away from her, knowing his wife and his children were only feet away. Eventually, though, that gunshot wound was too much, and he collapsed to the floor, lying on his back, not dead, but unable to move. But there was more, because Erica was next. Erica was by the couch holding her children when her husband was shot in the face. But Erica was the person that Michele Anderson truly, truly hated. As I said, Erica was Scott's high school sweetheart, and Michele Anderson and her brother had been very, very close through their teenage years. But Erica Anderson entered Scott's life when they were both in high school together. Erica Anderson married Michele Anderson's brother, and Erica Anderson supplanted Michele in the life of her brother, Scott. Michele Anderson hated her sister-in-law. After Scott collapsed on the floor, Michele Anderson then took that .357 revolver and turned it on Erica. She fired one shot. It in all likelihood missed, but the second shot did not, nor did the third. Erica was shot multiple times, at least 2 times, by the defendant using that .357 revolver. And Erica began to scream and scream and to crawl away and to try and get away. And what she managed to do was, even though she'd been shot multiple times, she climbed over the back of the love seat, across an end table, trying to get to a telephone table where there was a phone so that she could call 911. Erica did this even though she had been shot multiple times. And in fact, the defendant, when she was interviewed by the detectives, commented, quote, "I don't know how she did that," unquote, because she'd been shot so many times. Erica got on the phone. She dialed 911. The call was connected, and it was logged in at 5:13 p.m. on December 24th, 2007. Just as the 911 operator answered the call, the line went dead. Erica then crawled back to where her children were in front of the couch. She collapsed on the floor, seated partially against the couch with her legs in front of her on the floor, seated upright, but barely alive. Now, Michele Anderson told the detectives that she fired 4 shots into Scott and 2 into Erica, and that she ran out of bullets. It's a 6-shot revolver. But Joe McEnroe, remember, was trying to unjam the 9mm. And it was while he was trying to unjam the 9mm that Erica managed to make that phone call to 911. Erica now is shot, fatally wounded, but not yet dead, seated or slumped in front of the couch. And there was more, because Olivia was next. Olivia, in all likelihood, by this point had already been shot once. Of the 4 shots that Michele Anderson told the detective she fired at her brother, we know that at least 1 or 2 of them missed. The line of fire would have been such that Olivia would have been standing right behind her father, and she was hit in the abdomen. That bullet that struck Olivia in the abdomen passed completely through her body. She was only 5 years old at the time, and came out her lower back and lodged in a pillow that was on the couch. Olivia then crawled to where her mother had collapsed on the floor in front of the love seat, and face down she tried to hide underneath her mother. Meanwhile, Joseph McEnroe got the 9mm unjammed. He then stood directly over Olivia as she was trying to hide underneath her mother and fired a bullet into the back of her head. That bullet came out the front of Olivia's head and lodged in the floor underneath her. So desperate were Olivia's efforts to get away that you'll see the photographs of Olivia as she burrowed herself underneath her mother's right arm. She was wedged so tightly there trying to get away that that's why Linda Teeley and the detectives, or the deputies who first showed up at the scene, didn't see her body, because she was wedged between the coffee table and the sofa and underneath the right side of her mother. And finally, there was more. Nathan was next. The defendant had shot Scott Anderson, and Scott Anderson was lying motionless on the floor of the family room. He shot Erica. She was seated, propped up against the love seat or the couch, and she had run out of bullets. Joseph McEnroe had unjammed the 9mm and shot Olivia Anderson. So Joe McEnroe then took that 9mm and turned his attention to Nathan. And he did it by firing a bullet into the left side of Nathan's head. It passed completely through his head and exited on the right. As I mentioned, Nathan was 3 years old. Wayne was dead, Judy was dead, Scott was dead, Erica was dead. Why shoot the children? Well, the detectives asked. And the defendant said that she told Joe McEnroe to shoot the kids because, in her view, children would be scarred forever having witnessed what they witnessed, and because the children had seen who had done it. Shooting the kids, in the defendant's words, quote, was like a culmination of not wanting them to live with these memories and not wanting witnesses, unquote. But she attempted to absolve herself at first. She described the shooting of Nathan, 3-year-old Nathan, this way, quote, Nathan looked like he knew that he was going to die and was accepting of it, unquote. But the defendant, at a different portion of the interview, also described the terror that the children went through. She described the murders of Olivia and Nathan this way, quote, they were clinging to their mom, screaming, unquote. After the defendant, Michele Anderson, Joseph McEnroe were done, they tried to destroy evidence in a fire pit outside their home down the hill. They burned all the towels and rugs that they had used. They also burned Judy Anderson's wallet. At some point, they got into their truck and they drove all around the area. They eventually found themselves on I-5 going north. They went to a bridge that was over a river. Michele Anderson, who was driving, because Joseph McEnroe didn't drive, Michele Anderson pulled over. They wrapped the guns, the extra ammunition, all of that stuff into a shirt. They wrapped it up. Joe McEnroe got out of the truck, walked back to the middle of the bridge, and threw it over the side. And finally, the defendant admitted to the detectives that she and McEnroe collaborated on what they would say to detectives if they were ever stopped. How they agreed that they would say they last saw Wayne and Judy on the morning of Christmas Eve, how they told them they were engaged, how they were planning on going to Las Vegas to get married. Indeed, they both told very similar lies throughout the first 35 to 45 minutes of their respective interviews. They also admitted, or she also admitted, that these murders were planned. She was asked a question, for example, what was the purpose of carrying the guns up there? And her answer, quote, because I'm tired of everybody stepping on me. At one point, she said that she brought the guns to her parents' home because she thought Scott might attack her. But the detectives reminded her that Scott wasn't there when she went to her parents' home. And then she admitted that she went up to her home with those guns to shoot Scott. She told the detectives that she had thought about shooting her parents for 2 weeks. She thought about shooting Scott for 2 weeks. She said, quote, if the problem wasn't resolved, I was going to kill them. I went up there, and if they didn't give me my money and stop attacking me and slandering me across town, I would shoot them. Quote, yes, it was premeditated, and yes, I was fed up with everything. I went up there knowing I would probably shoot these people, but I didn't want to, unquote. At about 1:15 that same afternoon, December 26, 2007, in the course of interviewing Michele Anderson, Detectives Tompkins and Peters took a break, and they asked another detective, Robin Cleary, to sit with Michele Anderson, just for safety and security. And as soon as Detective Cleary sat down, Michele Anderson began talking to her about the case. Talked about her brother Scott and how much money he owed her. Talked about her parents wanting her to pay rent. Talking about how they refused to help her get her money back from her brother. She complained and complained and complained about money, money, and money, about her brother and her parents. She also repeated many of the details that she'd given about the murders, what she'd already told Detectives Tompkins and Peters. She talked about the cleanup. She talked about getting rid of the extra ammunition and where she and McEnroe had gone following the murders. Detective Cleary sat with the defendant for about 40 minutes, and just before 2 o'clock that afternoon, Detectives Tompkins and Peters came back and resumed their recorded conversation. When they asked Michele Anderson, will you take us, try to retrace your steps following the murders, see if we can find the weapons? And she agreed to do that. So they drove to a gas station in Monroe, they drove to a market in Gold Bar, and the defendant continued to talk to them as they drove, Detective Peters taking notes. She talked about that she hadn't worked in a year, that Joe McEnroe had quit his job about a month before the murders, about a month before Christmas Eve, and that after the murders themselves happened, she said that she had taken her mom's wallet from her mom's purse and took $40 from it and then burned her mother's wallet in the fire pit down below. They had searched for Wayne's wallet, searched for her dad's wallet, but they couldn't find it. And she continued to talk to them about why her family was killed. Quote, "I hated these people to be like trash, and I turned into trash. I wanted my mom, brother, and dad to die because they abused me over the years. I wasted my life because of these, I apologize, because of these assholes. It's not fair," unquote. Well, the detectives and Michele Anderson tried to find the spot where the guns had been tossed. Eventually, they drove north on I-5, and later that afternoon, they came up to where I-5 crosses the Stillaguamish River. It's right about exit 208. The defendant, again, repeated her description about how she parked the truck the night of the murders. They packed up, they wrapped up the guns and the ammunition. Joseph McEnroe got out of the truck, walked back to the middle of the bridge, and tossed what was in his hands over the side. The detectives then came downtown. They went to Harborview Medical Center. They had a search warrant to take a blood sample from Michele Anderson for purposes of DNA analysis. And at 7 o'clock on the evening of December 26, 2007, Michele Anderson was booked into the King County Jail. As I mentioned, the defendant talked to the detectives from the late morning of December 26 to the late afternoon of December 26, and a number of things emerged from that conversation. The evidence will show you in this case that the motivation for these murders was pure, unadulterated greed. And Michele Anderson spoke about that motive repeatedly and incessantly. Throughout the interview, she talked about money, who owed her money, who was forcing her to pay rent, how unfair it was, over and over and over again. She complained that her parents would not reimburse her for improvements that she had made to the mobile home she was living in rent-free. She talked about how her parents wanted her to pay her car insurance because she didn't have to pay that either. How angry she was. And as I mentioned to you, her very first comment when she said, "It's my fault," was, quote, "My brother owes me a lot of money," unquote. "I just wanted the money he took from me," unquote. "It hurt when he took that money and didn't give it back," unquote. "I'm in a lot of trouble now over some stupid money," unquote. The stupid money, I shouldn't have done anything like this. In fact, Michele Anderson mentioned money as a motive more than 35 times in the course of that interview. And as I mentioned earlier, rent. How angry she was that her parents wanted her to pay rent. She'd been living on the property for a year rent-free. She was 29 years old. Joseph McEnroe was 29 years old. They both had quit their jobs. And Wayne and Judy said, maybe it's time to start paying rent. And she thought that was a betrayal. She hated her parents for that because they wanted her to pay rent. She said, quote, "I told them that I wanted my money back and I didn't want to be out in the street. They said that I had to start paying them immediately or get out." Detectives also learned during the course of that interview the full measure of her anger at her brother Scott and his wife Erica, and how she talked about how things changed, in her words, when Erica Anderson came into the life of her brother. And she tried to minimize Joseph McEnroe's role in all this. She said repeatedly statements like, "It's my fault. It's not Joe's fault. Joe wasn't even up there. I told Joe to go back to the house." According to the defendant, McEnroe told her before the murders even happened, "Just walk away. Don't do this. Just walk away." She told the detectives that it was her idea. Quote, "He wouldn't have done this if I hadn't asked him to help me," unquote. At one point, she claimed that she shot everybody. At another point, she claimed that McEnroe shot some of the people. She said that Joseph McEnroe only fired additional bullets into everyone after they were already dead. Again, members of the jury, almost everything that the defendant said about Joseph McEnroe is untrue. It was a lie. Well, as I mentioned, when Detective Tompkins and Detective Peters were interviewing Michele Anderson, Detective Jake Pavlovich was interviewing Joseph McEnroe. That interview began about the same time, 11:10. They talked for a couple of hours. Joseph McEnroe was asked questions, gave some background information. But during that interview, Detective Jake Pavlovich would take breaks, and he would contact Scott Tompkins. They would compare notes as to what each of their people they were interviewing were saying. And what Detective Pavlovich learned from Detective Tompkins changed the way he interviewed Joseph McEnroe. Detective Pavlovich's interview with Joe McEnroe ended at about 3:20 in the afternoon on December 26, 2007. And when it ended, Joseph McEnroe was arrested for murder. Now, the .357 revolver, the 9mm semi-automatic were not recovered at the scene of the house, at the scene of the crimes in the house, but a number of shell casings from the 9mm were recovered, and they were submitted for ballistic testing. And it was discovered by Rick Wyant of the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab that those shell casings were consistent with a 9mm semi-automatic weapon. Even though they didn't have the weapon, the shell casings were at least the right caliber. Recall how I mentioned to you that Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe wrapped the weapons and the ammunition and threw them off the bridge. Well, the King County Sheriff's Office, working with the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, did a number of searches of the Stillaguamish. They did 3 searches in January of 2008, about a week after the murders, January 3rd, January 24th, and January 25th, but they could not find either the .357 or the 9mm. However, 3.5 years later, July of 2011, a teenage boy named Jared Cinema, who lived right near the property, he lives on a milk farm up in Snohomish County, was playing along the banks of the Stillaguamish River when he noticed a belt or a holster of some type sticking out of the sand. When he retrieved that holster, he found inside a .357 revolver. That was turned over to the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office. That was in turn given to Detective Tompkins, who then forwarded to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. Now, as this crime scene is being processed, it's the days after December 26th, 27th, and 28th. It took a long, long time to process this crime scene because of the number of bodies, the number of wounds, the amount of blood, other kinds of evidence at the scene. But one of the people who responded immediately was the Chief Medical Examiner for King County, a fellow by the name of Dr. Richard Hariff. And he began the process of examining the bodies at the scene for purposes of doing autopsies in his office later on. The following day, he began those autopsies. He autopsied the body of Wayne Anderson and determined that Wayne had been shot in the left side of his head, the area of his temple. The bullet had passed completely through Wayne's head, and no bullet was left to recover. Although there were bullet fragments inside, those fragments were too small, too dispersed to be able to identify or associate with any particular caliber of weapon. In addition, Dr. Hariff noticed something else. He noticed that Wayne was clad only in a t-shirt, and as I mentioned, those jeans that had been down around his ankles when his body was discovered. When Dr. Hariff recovered Wayne Anderson's body, it was lying face down in the mud in front of that shed. He noticed that on Wayne Anderson's back, on his white t-shirt, was the imprint of a boot. Judy Anderson's autopsy was also done by Dr. Hariff. He determined that she had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. She was shot once in the left side of her neck from a downward angle, as if somebody was shooting at her from above, shooting down as if she was collapsing to the floor. But she was also shot a second time, a devastating bullet wound to the left side of her forehead. That bullet transected her brain and was recovered from the right side of her skull. But he also noticed something more about his autopsy of Judy Anderson. He noticed the presence of stippling on Judy Anderson's face. Stippling comes from the sort of gases and powders that are expelled by a gun as a bullet discharges and leaves the barrel. There's a bunch of gas and powder that comes out. If you're standing far enough away, there's no evidence of stippling because you're not close enough. But if the gun is held in close proximity to the surface it's being fired at, you will see these dots, these perforations called stippling. And there was stippling on Judy Anderson's face, indicating that the person who shot her in the head was standing very, very close to her when he pulled the trigger. Finally, Dr. Hariff determined that the bullet recovered from inside Judy's head was fired from a .357 revolver. He next examined Scott Anderson's body. He found that Scott Anderson was shot once in the face. The bullet entered just underneath his lip, exited underneath his chin, entered Scott Anderson's throat, and lodged in his lung. Scott Anderson was also shot a second time. He was shot in the abdomen, right in front, and that the bullet had passed completely through his body and was lying, was sort of trapped in his t-shirt because remember his body was on the floor. And they recovered the free spent bullet from inside his t-shirt when they recovered his body. But he also noticed something else about Scott Anderson's abdominal wound. He noticed what it appeared to be what's called a near contact wound. You see, if you look close enough, like stippling on a face, you see powder granules on the surface next to where that weapon was fired, indicating that that gun was being held right up against Scott Anderson's abdomen when that bullet was fired through his body. Dr. Hariff also performed Erica Anderson's autopsy, and he determined that Erica Anderson was shot many, many, many times. One bullet entered Erica's right hip, exited her hip, transited across her abdomen, and re-entered her left hip, causing 5 bullet wounds from one bullet. A second bullet entered Erica's right abdomen, traveled from right to left and downward, and exited her body. It caused 2 bullet wounds. A third bullet entered Erica's left flank, transected her body, and was recovered from inside her chest. A fourth bullet entered the left side of Erica's upper chest and exited just under her left armpit, creating 2 more bullet wounds. A fifth bullet entered Erica's right upper chest and was recovered from her right lung. And finally, 1 bullet entered Erica's forehead almost directly between her eyes, traveling from left to right and downward, and was recovered from inside her head. And Dr. Harif noticed, again as he had with Judy, that there was stippling on Erica Anderson's face around where that bullet entered her forehead, indicating that the shooter was in close proximity to her when the trigger was pulled. Erica Anderson was shot at least 6 times. She suffered 12 gunshot-related wounds from a .357 and a 9mm semi-automatic. Dr. Harif noticed something else about one of Erica's wounds. The wound that went into her right upper chest, the bullet that was recovered from that wound in her right lung. He noticed that in that wound itself, there was a clump of very fair, light brown hair. And he noticed that when he recovered the bullet from her lung, there was hair there as well, inside her lung, along with bone fragments. Dr. Harif completed the autopsy of Olivia Anderson on December 28th, determined that she had been shot twice. She suffered 5 gunshot wounds. She had a wound to her abdomen that passed completely through her body, exiting out her back. She also suffered a grazing wound to her wrist, in all likelihood made by the bullet that passed through her abdomen if she was holding her wrist in front of her. She also suffered a gunshot wound, a devastating gunshot wound to the back of her head. That bullet transected Olivia's brain, exited her forehead, and was recovered from a heating duct immediately in the floor beneath where Olivia Anderson's forehead was touching the floor at the time her body was recovered. She was face down, as I mentioned, next to her mother. And then finally, Dr. Harif performed the autopsy for Nathan Anderson. He was shot once in his left temple. That bullet entered the left side of Nathan Anderson's head. It exited the right side of Nathan Anderson's head, and it was recovered later. And again, Dr. Harif noticed that there was stippling present all around on Nathan's face from the close proximity gunshot wound that was delivered that put that bullet through his brain. In all, there were at least 16 rounds, 16 bullets fired by Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe on December 24th, 2007. The victims were hit 14 times. It caused almost 30 bullet wounds in the 6 victims. 8 bullets were recovered from the bodies of the victims. 6 more bullets were recovered at the scene by the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, and there were at least 2 bullets that were never found and that were never recovered. But meanwhile, throughout all of this, the investigation continued. The investigation continued far beyond December 26, 2007. It was exhaustive. It involved processing the evidence, processing the scene for evidence, forensic testing, and the search for more evidence. As I mentioned, detectives learned that there had been a 911 call on December 24th, 2007, and they confirmed that it was a hang-up call that came in at about 5:13 in the afternoon. The 911 operator who took that call noted that nobody appeared to speak directly into the phone. She could hear loud noises, and there were possibly voices in the background. Detectives learned that that happened at 5:30. At 5:15, 911 called back. That's protocol. You get a 911 hang-up call, 911 invariably will call back to make certain everything is okay. When 911 called back, there was no answer at the Anderson residence. At 5:19, King County Sheriff's deputies were dispatched to the scene of the hang-up 911 call on Christmas Eve. At 5:20, 911 called back to the Anderson residence again, and again, there was no answer. The King County Sheriff's deputies arrived 20 minutes or so later. They drove up that same driveway I've described to you. They found that gate locked and closed in front of them. They got out of their cars and they looked around. Remember, it's Christmas Eve. It's dark. There's no lighting whatsoever. It's overcast, and everything is quiet. They hear nothing going on and nothing wrong. They spoke to the neighbors who reported nothing amiss, nothing in the surrounding area seemed to be wrong. So they decided, since they really didn't have good cause to be able to go around that fence, and farther up the driveway, and so that they left. That was about 5:45 in the afternoon of December 24th, 2007. The detectives later learned that Michele Anderson, following the murder of her family, went down that driveway and closed and locked the gate in response to Erica Anderson calling 911, because she feared and she knew that the police were on their way. The Washington State Patrol Crime Lab processed the murder scene. They recovered a lot of evidence. There are bullets and bullet fragments, shell casings, blood evidence, and things like that. The crime lab analyzed a lot of the evidence, a lot of the blood evidence from different locations, from different areas of the kitchen, from the bathroom, from the laundry room, and they submitted that blood evidence for testing by the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. Ballistics testing to determine what gun fired those bullets if they could, DNA testing. They also prepared for a crime scene reconstruction to try to understand the sequence of events of exactly what happened. The DNA analysis, as I say, was extensive. I'll give you one example of what they learned. They had DNA from the Anderson home, DNA from the general crime scene around the Anderson home, and they even had DNA from the clothing taken from Michele Anderson and Joseph McEnroe at their arrest. The crime lab identified the DNA from the victims at various locations. Inside the home, on numerous pieces of evidence, bullets and shell casings and bullet fragments. But there was more. DNA was identified, Wayne's DNA, his blood, was identified on Michele Anderson's boots. Judy Anderson's blood and DNA were identified on Joseph McEnroe's boots. But there was more. Because as I mentioned, there was ballistics testing that was done of the fragments and the shell casings and the bullets recovered from the scene. And Rick Wyatt from the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab was able to identify which of the bullets recovered from inside the bodies, which of the bullets recovered at the scene, in all likelihood came from a 9mm and a .357 revolver. In addition, Rick Wyatt examined that .357 that was recovered by Jared Cinema on the banks of the Stillaguamish. He found that the .357 had been there for 3.5 years. It was heavily, heavily damaged and corroded. It was so damaged it wouldn't allow him to do a test firing from it in order to compare a bullet fired from that weapon with the bullets recovered at the scene. But that .357 revolver still had shell casings inside of it. And he was able to, Rick Wyatt was able to compare those shell casings with shell casings recovered from inside the Anderson home. And he determined that the shell casings from that gun that was recovered on the banks of the Stillaguamish matched the shell casings recovered from inside the Anderson home. The weapon that was recovered from the Stillaguamish, where Michele Anderson said she and Joe McEnroe threw it, was one of the murder weapons on December 24th, 2007. Members of the jury, there is no doubt that one of the persons who committed these crimes on Christmas Eve 2007 is sitting in this courtroom, and her name is Michele Anderson. As I mentioned to you, this will be in some ways a difficult case. I talked about some of the witnesses who will be a little bit nervous, I predict, anxious about testifying, wondering about their memories after 8 years. The subject matter will be difficult. We talked a little bit about that in jury selection. Not just the murder of 3 generations of a family, but frankly the murder of children. A little girl who was 5 years old, whose life ended before it ever really began at the age of 5. A little boy whose life was cut short at the age of 3. A little boy who was still in diapers at his autopsy. The testimony of what the defendant and Joseph McEnroe did to these victims will be difficult. Discussions of the use of multiple weapons and gunshot wounds. You'll see photographs of the scene, photographs from the autopsy. It will not be easy to look at them, but we must look at them. But as I pledged to you in jury selection, and I repeat that pledge now, it will not be done gratuitously. They'll be in front of you for as brief a period as is necessary to show them, and then we'll take them off the screen. Members of the jury, this is, as I say, will not be an easy case, but I'll ask you to roll up your sleeves and to examine all of the evidence, no matter who presents it, critically in the course of this case. Finally, I've spoken at length regarding what happened on Christmas Eve 2007, what happened inside the Anderson home, what happened to the 6 victims whose bodies were found there. And frankly, I don't think that there's one single piece of evidence that truly sort of conveys the callousness and senselessness of these crimes. But let me offer one last observation that may bring things into perspective. Recall I told you that the King County Medical Examiner Richard Harriff began his examination of the bodies on scene on December 26, 2007, the same day that Linda Tilley discovered the bodies. He examined those bodies where they were found, And that's preliminary to doing the autopsy back at his offices at Harborview. He examined in particular also Erica's body and the 12 bullet wounds that she suffered. And one wound in particular grabbed or drew Dr. Harif's attention. And that was the bullet wound that was in Erica's right upper chest that I mentioned to you. That was the bullet wound that on the scene when Dr. Harif examined it, he saw a small clump of very fair, light brown hair inside the wound. And he'll tell you, on scene, he asked himself, how do you explain this? What would have caused this? This doesn't make any sense. At autopsy, Dr. Harif was able to examine that wound even more carefully. He was able to remove the bullet that caused that wound from Erica's right lung. And when he did remove that bullet from inside her lung, he found, again, small evidence of faint brown hair, and he found bone matter inside her lung where there should be no bone matter. Dr. Harif then did something else. Dr. Harif compared the exit wound on the right side of Nathan's head with the entrance wound on the right side of Olivia's chest. And they matched. Dr. Harif referred to them as kissing wounds. They were mirror images of each other. How do you explain that? Well, the physical evidence in the DNA helps us understand what happened. That clump of fair brown hair in the entrance wound and inside Erica's lung is not Erica's. It's Nathan's. That bone matter that was found inside Erica's lung is not Erica's. It is Nathan's. In the final, furious last moments of her life, Erica Anderson looked into the eyes of the woman and the man who were killing her family. This woman and Joseph McEnroe. And as she did that, her 3-year-old son, Nathan, climbed into his mother's arms. Having witnessed his father being shot, having seen his sister being shot, having watched as his mother was used for target practice, Nathan climbed into the arms of his mother for safety, and he placed his head against her chest and next to her heart. And then Joseph McEnroe fired a bullet into Nathan's head, and that bullet passed completely through his head and blew pieces of Nathan's skull into Erica's chest. The second to last thing that Erica Anderson saw on this earth was this woman, Michele Anderson, and Joseph McEnroe standing over her, firing a bullet into her son's head as she held him. But there's more. They weren't done. Because having shot Erica 5 times, having shot her son in the head, having inflicted a dozen gunshot wounds on her, they then turned the gun again on Erica, and they fired a shot right between her eyes in the middle of her forehead. Members of the jury, this is a serious case, and I will ask you to critically examine all the evidence as it's presented to you. All of the evidence in its totality will convince you far beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crimes she's accused of. Call it what you will, mass murder, the obliteration of a family, that's not necessary. At the time of closing argument, I will stand before you again and simply ask you to call it what it is. 6 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree for the murder of Wayne Anderson, Judy Anderson, Scott Anderson, Erica Anderson, Olivia Anderson, and Nathan Anderson. Thank you.
And Mr. Sorensen, does the defense wish to present opening statement on behalf of the defense at this time, or do you still wish to reserve opening until the conclusion of this presentation of the state's case in chief?
Good morning, Your Honor. Thank you. We would like to reserve our opening at this time until the conclusion of the state's case.
All right, thank you very much, sir. So ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do at this point in time, we're going to take a morning recess. I'm going to send you back to the jury room briefly, and then when we resume, you'll start hearing evidence from the state's witnesses, and we'll distribute the notepads and pens